They forged my signature to steal my property, my wife and my own brother. I trusted two people more than anyone else in this world. My wife, who I married believing she would stand beside me forever, and my older brother, the man who was supposed to protect me since we were children. Instead, they sat together at my own dining table, planning how to steal my property behind my back. They forged my signature. They lied to a notary. They tried to erase my name from everything I owned. They thought I was too busy, too trusting, too blind to ever find out. They were wrong. And when the police finally knocked on their door, I watched both of them cry, not because they were sorry for what they did to me, but because they got caught. This is the story of how my wife and my own brother tried to destroy me, and how the truth destroyed them instead. Stay until the end. My name is David Mitchell. I am 44 years old. This is the story of how the two people I trusted most in this world, my wife Rachel and my older brother Thomas, almost destroyed everything I had worked for. I want to start from the beginning because I think it is important for you to understand who I was before all of this happened, so you can understand how deeply this betrayal cut into me. I grew up in a small town, the younger of two brothers. Thomas was 5 years older than me. Our parents were hard-working people, not wealthy, but honest. My father worked as a mechanic for 30 years. My mother raised us and worked part-time at a local grocery store. We did not have much money growing up, but we had each other, and as children, Thomas and I were close. He taught me how to ride a bicycle. He protected me from bullies at school. When our father passed away when I was 22, Thomas stepped up in many ways, helping our mother, helping me finish my education, acting like a second father when I needed guidance the most. I never forgot that. Even as adults, even after we both married and built separate lives, I always felt a deep sense of loyalty toward Thomas. I believed, completely, that he would always have my back, the same way he did when we were children. I met Rachel when I was 28 years old. She was working as an interior designer at the time, sharp, confident, and beautiful. We dated for 2 years before I proposed, and I remember feeling like the luckiest man alive when she said yes. Our wedding day was one of the happiest days of my life. I stood at the altar, looking at her walking toward me, and I promised myself that I would spend the rest of my life making her happy, protecting her, building a future together. For the first several years of our marriage, things were good. I worked hard, first as a project manager for a construction company, and later, after years of saving and learning the industry, I started my own small property development business. I bought my first piece of land when I was 32 years old, a modest plot on the edge of town, and built a small apartment complex on it. That first project succeeded beyond my expectations, and over the following 12 years, I grew my business steadily, piece by piece, building a portfolio of properties across our region, apartment buildings, a small shopping plaza, several rental houses, and finally the property that would become the center of this entire story, a large commercial building downtown that I had purchased 5 years ago and spent significant money renovating into a modern office complex. This building, which I called the Mitchell Commerce Center, was worth, by the time this story truly begins, close to $2 million. It was not just a building to me. It represented 12 years of hard work, careful decisions, sleepless nights, and sacrifice. It was the crown jewel of everything I had built with my own 2 hands, starting from nothing. I registered most of my properties, including the Commerce Center, jointly under my name and Rachel's name, as is common between married couples, believing completely in the strength and permanence of our marriage. I never imagined, not for a single moment, that this trust would eventually become the exact weapon used against me. As for Thomas, my brother had taken a different path in life. He struggled financially for many years, moving between different jobs, never quite finding the same success I had found in property development. I never judged him for this. Everyone's path is different, and I always tried to help him when I could, lending him money during difficult times, helping him find work through my own business connections, including him in family gatherings and holidays without ever making him feel less than equal, despite our different financial circumstances. Looking back now, I understand that this difference, this gap between my success and his struggles, planted a seed somewhere inside him, a seed of resentment that grew slowly over many years, hidden beneath a friendly, brotherly exterior that I never once questioned. I did not know, during all those years of trust and generosity, that my wife and my brother had begun spending significant time together, initially through innocent family gatherings, but eventually through a connection that would grow into something far darker than simple friendship between in-laws. I want you to understand, before I continue this story, that I am not writing this to seek pity. I am writing this because I believe there are lessons here, important lessons about trust, about vigilance, and about what happens when the people closest to us decide that our success is something to be stolen rather than celebrated. Looking back now, I can identify small signs that something was changing, signs I dismissed at the time because I could not imagine, even for a moment, that my wife and my brother were capable of what they eventually did. About 2 years before this story reaches its climax, I began noticing that Rachel and Thomas seemed to communicate more frequently outside of normal family contexts. At first, this seemed harmless. Thomas would call to ask Rachel's advice about interior design choices for a small apartment he was renovating. Rachel would mention, casually, that she had run into Thomas at a coffee shop near her office. These small interactions felt natural, even pleasant, evidence that my brother and my wife got along well, something I had always hoped for within our family. But slowly, subtly, the frequency and nature of these interactions began to shift. I started noticing text messages on Rachel's phone from Thomas at unusual hours, late evening, sometimes even late at night. When I asked about them, Rachel would explain them away easily. "Thomas is going through a hard time with his divorce," she would say, referring to the separation Thomas had gone through about 18 months earlier. "He just needs someone to talk to sometimes." I believed her. Why would I not believe her? She was my wife. He was my brother. It seemed natural that they might support each other emotionally, especially during Thomas's difficult divorce. Around this same time, I began working longer hours at the Commerce Center, overseeing a major renovation project on the building's upper floors, converting unused space into additional rentable office units. This project demanded significant attention, frequent site visits, long meetings with contractors and potential tenants. I often left home before 6 in the morning and returned after 8 in the evening, exhausted, focused entirely on ensuring this expansion project succeeded. I did not realize, during this intensely busy period, how much space and opportunity I was unknowingly creating within my own marriage. Space that Rachel and Thomas would eventually fill with something far more calculated than casual emotional support. The first, genuinely strange moment occurred about 8 months before everything came fully into the open. I came home unexpectedly early one afternoon, having finished a site meeting faster than planned, and found Thomas's car parked in our driveway. This was not entirely unusual. Thomas visited occasionally, but something about the atmosphere when I walked into the house felt different. Rachel and Thomas were sitting at our dining table, papers spread out between them, and when I walked in, they both seemed startled, quickly gathering the papers together. "What's going on?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than suspicious at that point. "Oh, nothing important," Rachel said quickly. "Thomas just needed some advice about a rental property he's considering. You know I still have contacts in real estate from my design days." This explanation seemed reasonable enough at the time, and I did not push further, trusting, as I always had, that my wife and brother were simply being helpful to each other. I remember even feeling a small sense of warmth, thinking how nice it was that Rachel was willing to help Thomas navigate the property world I had spent years mastering myself. I wish, now, looking back, that I had asked more questions in that moment. I wish I had looked more closely at those papers spread across my dining table. But hindsight offers clarity that trust, by its very nature, blinds us from seeing in the moment. Over the following months, small inconsistencies continued accumulating, individually minor, but forming a pattern I failed to recognize until much later. Rachel began asking unusual questions about our joint property documents, questions she framed as simple curiosity about making sure everything is properly organized, but which, I would later understand, were actually reconnaissance, gathering information about exactly which documents existed, where they were stored, and what would be required to alter or forge them convincingly. She asked, for instance, about where I kept the original deed documents for the Commerce Center. I told her, without suspicion, that they were stored in a fireproof safe in my home office, along with copies at my lawyer's office, and digital copies backed up on a secure cloud server I used for business records. She asked about my typical signature style, commenting one evening that my signature had changed slightly over the years, becoming more rushed and less legible as my business grew busier. I laughed this off as a natural observation, never imagining she might be studying my handwriting for a far darker purpose. She even asked, during what seemed like an innocent conversation about estate planning, whether I had ever set up any additional legal protections around my properties, similar to trusts or special ownership structures that might complicate a straightforward property transfer. I told her, honestly, that everything was straightforward, registered jointly under both our names, with standard legal documentation, nothing unusual or complicated. This answer, I would later realize, likely gave her exactly the confidence she needed to believe that stealing my properties would be a relatively simple, achievable plan. I share these details not to suggest I should have somehow predicted betrayal from these small moments, but because I believe it is important for others to understand how patiently, how calculatedly, this kind of family betrayal can be constructed, piece by piece, hidden within seemingly innocent conversations and interactions, while the intended victim, myself in this case, remains completely unaware, trusting the people closest to him without a single thought of suspicion. I remember one particular evening that, looking back now, stands out as perhaps the clearest warning sign I failed to recognize at the time. It was our 10th wedding anniversary, and I had planned a quiet dinner at home, wanting to celebrate the milestone privately rather than with a large gathering. Rachel seemed distracted throughout the evening, checking her phone more frequently than usual, and at one point stepped out onto our back porch to take a call she described only as work-related, even though it was a Saturday evening and her design firm rarely required weekend calls. When she returned inside, her mood had shifted slightly, a kind of nervous energy replacing the relaxed warmth she had shown earlier in the evening. I asked if everything was all right, and she assured me it was simply a minor scheduling issue with a client project. I believed her without question, raising a toast instead to another decade of marriage together, never imagining that the call she had just taken involved coordinating details of a scheme designed to steal my life's work. I have thought about that anniversary dinner many times since learning the full truth. I do not know with certainty that the call was related to the fraud, but the timing, considering everything I later learned about the timeline of their planning, makes it difficult not to wonder. It serves, for me, as a painful symbol of how completely two ordinary lives, my marriage and my relationship with my brother, could continue functioning outwardly, while something so damaging quietly took shape just beneath the surface. The plan that Rachel and Thomas eventually constructed required forging my signature on a power of attorney document, a legal document that, if valid, would have granted Rachel broad authority to manage, sell, or transfer my properties, including the Commerce Center, without requiring my direct signature on every individual transaction. To make this forged document appear legitimate, they needed it notarized, a process that typically requires the person signing the document to appear in person before a licensed notary, presenting identification and signing in the notary's presence. This is where their plan began to unravel, though I would not discover this unraveling for several more months. Rachel and Thomas approached a notary named Gerald Watkins, operating out of a small strip mall office that also offered tax preparation and basic legal document services. Gerald had been in business for over 15 years, generally known in the community as reliable, though perhaps not always as rigorous about verification procedures as larger, more established notary services might be. According to what I would later learn through the investigation, Thomas visited Gerald's office alone one afternoon, presenting a power of attorney document that appeared to already contain my signature, along with a copy of my driver's license, which he claimed I had given him to bring on my behalf, since I was, according to the story they had prepared, too busy with an urgent business trip to appear in person myself. This alone should have raised immediate red flags. Legitimate notarization requires the actual signer to be physically present. However, Gerald, perhaps trusting Thomas's confident, casual explanation, perhaps simply being less careful than professional standards required, agreed to notarize the document based on the pre-existing signature and the photocopied identification, rather than requiring my actual presence. This single decision, this single shortcut, taken by an overworked, insufficiently careful notary, became the crack in the foundation that Rachel and Thomas's entire plan was built upon, though none of us understood this yet. With the notarized power of attorney document in hand, Rachel began taking small, careful steps to test whether this fraudulent authority would actually function as intended within the legal and financial systems. She first used the document to request updated records from the county property office regarding several of our smaller rental properties, requests that were processed without issue since they did not yet involve any actual transfer of ownership. Encouraged by this initial success, Rachel and Thomas grew bolder. About 4 months after obtaining the fraudulent power of attorney, they began the process of attempting to transfer ownership of the Commerce Center, the crown jewel of my entire property portfolio, entirely into Rachel's name alone, effectively removing my ownership completely. Their reasoning, as I would later understand through evidence gathered during the investigation, involved a plan for Rachel to eventually divorce me, having already secured sole ownership of the Commerce Center beforehand, while Thomas, in exchange for his help executing this scheme, would receive a substantial cash payment once the property was successfully transferred and later sold or refinanced. This was not, I would come to understand with deep pain, a spontaneous betrayal born from sudden temptation. This was a carefully planned, methodically executed fraud, requiring months of preparation, patience, and calculated deception from two people I trusted completely, my wife and my own brother, working together against me. Fortunately, transferring ownership of a $2 million commercial property is not a simple, instant process, even with a fraudulent power of attorney in hand. The transaction required approval through the county recorder's office, review by a title company handling the transfer, and various administrative checks that, while not always perfectly rigorous, still introduced enough friction and processing time to prevent the fraud from completing instantly and invisibly. It was during this processing period, roughly 5 months before the true climax of this story, that I first encountered something that felt genuinely wrong, a small administrative email that would eventually unravel everything. It was a Tuesday morning in October when I received an email that would eventually change everything. I remember the date clearly because it was the same week my Commerce Center renovation project was finally being completed, and I was in an unusually good mood, feeling proud of everything I had built. The email came from the county title company, a routine-sounding message with the subject line, "Confirmation required, property transfer documentation, Mitchell Commerce Center." I almost deleted it without opening it fully, assuming it was related to some minor administrative matter connected to the renovation permits I had recently filed. But something made me pause and actually read the email carefully. It requested confirmation of a power of attorney document that had apparently been filed several months earlier, granting Rachel Mitchell authority to manage transactions related to the property, including a pending request to transfer full ownership into her name alone. I read this email 3 times, my confusion growing with each reading. I had never signed any power of attorney document. I had never discussed transferring the Commerce Center into Rachel's name alone. This had to be some kind of administrative error, a mix-up with another property, or another Mitchell family, somewhere in the county records. I called the title company immediately, and after being transferred between several departments, I finally spoke with a representative named Susan Park, who pulled up the file associated with my property. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, sounding slightly confused herself, "according to our records, we received a notarized power of attorney document 5 months ago, along with your identification, authorizing your wife to manage and potentially transfer this property. The transfer request itself was submitted about 6 weeks ago and has been moving through our standard processing timeline. I never signed any power of attorney document," I said, my voice becoming tight with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "I have never authorized any transfer of this property." There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to be honest with you. This is a serious situation. If what you're telling me is accurate, I would strongly recommend you contact a lawyer immediately, and we will place an immediate hold on any further processing of this transfer request while this is investigated." I sat in my car outside the Commerce Center for nearly 20 minutes after that call ended, staring blankly through the windshield, trying to process what I had just learned. Someone had forged my signature. Someone had created a fraudulent legal document. Someone had been quietly, secretly working to steal my property, and this someone had apparently gained enough legitimate-seeming authority to move this fraud significantly forward before I ever discovered it. And the name on that document, the person granted this fraudulent authority, was my own wife. I want to be honest about my emotional state in that moment. My first reaction was not immediate suspicion toward Rachel personally. My mind, still deeply rooted in years of trust and love, immediately searched for alternative explanations. Perhaps someone had stolen her identity alongside mine. Perhaps this was some kind of elaborate scam targeting our family, using both our names without either of us actually being involved. I did not yet want to believe that my wife, the woman I had built a life with for over a decade, could be directly, knowingly responsible for something this calculated and cruel. That evening, I approached Rachel carefully, still hoping desperately for an innocent explanation. "Rachel," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and neutral, "I got a strange call today from the title company about the Commerce Center. Something about a power of attorney document with your name on it. Do you know anything about this?" I watched her face very carefully as I asked this question, and what I saw made my stomach drop. For just a moment, barely a second, I saw something flash across her expression, something that looked unmistakably like panic, quickly replaced by a carefully composed look of confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice slightly too controlled, too rehearsed. "That sounds like some kind of scam or identity theft. We should probably contact the police." Her suggestion to contact the police, ironically, was exactly the right advice, though clearly not for the reasons she intended when she said it. But something about her reaction, the timing of that brief panic before her composed response, planted a seed of doubt in my mind that I could not ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. I did not confront her further that night. Instead, I made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. I decided to quietly, carefully investigate this situation myself before revealing how much I actually knew or suspected. The next morning, I called an old friend from my early construction days, a man named Daniel Foster, who had left project management years earlier to become a lawyer specializing in property and family law disputes. Daniel and I had remained close over the years, and I trusted him completely, both as a friend and as a professional who would understand exactly how to navigate the situation I was suddenly facing. Daniel said after I explained the entire situation to him over the phone, his voice serious and focused. If what you're describing is accurate, this is not just a civil property dispute. This sounds like criminal fraud, potentially involving forgery and false notarization. I need you to gather every piece of documentation you can find, but do it carefully, without alerting anyone in your household to what you're doing. Can you do that? Yes, I said, feeling a strange mixture of heartbreak and cold determination settling into my chest. I can do that. Good, Daniel said. And David, I know this is incredibly difficult, but you need to start thinking clearly, almost like a detective rather than a husband right now. We need evidence, real evidence, before we confront anyone directly. Can you handle that? I thought about Rachel's brief flash of panic the night before. I thought about Thomas's increasingly frequent, unexplained visits over the past year. I thought about small, strange conversations I had dismissed as innocent curiosity, conversations that now, viewed through this new, painful lens, looked entirely different. Yes, I said again, my voice steadier now. I can handle that. Over the following 3 weeks, working closely with Daniel, I began quietly gathering evidence, moving carefully to avoid alerting Rachel or Thomas to my growing suspicions. Daniel first helped me request a formal copy of the notarized power of attorney document directly from the county recorder's office, using my legal right as the property owner to access these records. When the document arrived, I felt a wave of nausea looking at the signature at the bottom, a signature clearly designed to resemble mine, but which, upon close comparison with my actual signature on other legitimate documents, showed subtle but distinct differences that I, having signed my own name thousands of times over the years, could recognize immediately once I knew to look carefully. Daniel arranged for a professional forensic document examiner, a woman named Linda Torres, who specialized in handwriting analysis and forgery detection, to formally review the signature. Her conclusion, delivered about 10 days after we submitted the samples, confirmed what I already suspected in my heart. The signature on the power of attorney document was not authentic. It showed characteristics consistent with forgery, likely created through careful tracing or copying from genuine signature samples, rather than being written naturally by the person whose name it claimed to represent. With this forensic confirmation in hand, Daniel and I turned our attention to identifying exactly who had submitted this fraudulent document and who had been involved in its creation. This is where Gerald Watkins, the notary who had improperly notarized the document without requiring my actual presence, became critically important to our investigation. Daniel, using his legal contacts, discovered that Gerald's notary business had actually come under scrutiny before for similar procedural shortcuts, though nothing serious enough to have resulted in the loss of his notary license at that point. Daniel arranged a meeting with Gerald, carefully explaining the serious legal consequences Gerald himself could face for improperly notarizing a fraudulent document, consequences that could include losing his notary license permanently, facing civil liability, or even potential criminal charges for negligence bordering on complicity in fraud. Faced with these serious threats to his own livelihood and freedom, Gerald quickly became cooperative, providing Daniel with his appointment records from the day the document was notarized. These records confirmed exactly what we suspected. Thomas Mitchell had visited Gerald's office alone that day, presenting the pre-signed document along with a photocopied driver's license, claiming he was acting on my behalf due to my supposed unavailability. This evidence directly implicated Thomas, moving this situation from a painful suspicion into concrete, documented proof that my own brother had personally, knowingly participated in creating a fraudulent legal document designed to steal my property. I remember the exact moment Daniel showed me Gerald's signed statement confirming Thomas's visit. I sat in Daniel's office, staring at the paper, feeling something inside me break in a way I had never experienced before. This was not a stranger who had betrayed me. This was not a distant business associate seeking easy profit. This was my brother, the same brother who taught me to ride a bicycle, who protected me from bullies, who helped raise me into the man I had become after our father's death. "David," Daniel said gently, noticing my silence, "I know this is incredibly painful, but we need to keep moving forward carefully. We still need to establish Rachel's full level of involvement, and we need to secure enough evidence to present this properly to law enforcement, in a way that ensures real accountability, rather than simply creating a messy legal dispute that drags on for years without resolution." Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel helped me access additional records, bank statements showing unusual transfers between Thomas's account and a separate account Rachel had apparently opened without my knowledge. Text message records, obtained through proper legal channels, given the seriousness of the ongoing fraud, showing explicit conversations between Rachel and Thomas, discussing timelines for completing the property transfer, discussing how they would eventually explain the situation to me if questioned, and disturbingly, discussing Rachel's plans to file for divorce shortly after the property transfer successfully completed, a plan that would have left me not only stripped of my most valuable property, but also facing a divorce process where Rachel would already hold significant, though fraudulently obtained, financial advantage. Reading these text messages, seeing in their own words how calculated, how deliberately cruel their plan had been, transformed my heartbreak into something harder, sharper. This was not a moment of weakness or temptation that Rachel and Thomas had succumbed to. This was a carefully constructed betrayal, planned and executed over many months, targeting not just my property, but my entire future, my sense of security, my trust in the 2 relationships I valued most in my life. "Daniel," I said during one of our meetings, my voice steady now, hardened by weeks of painful discovery, "I want to make sure they face real consequences for this. Not just losing access to my property, real, legal consequences." Daniel nodded slowly. "Given what we've gathered, David, I believe we have more than enough evidence to bring this directly to the police as a criminal fraud case, rather than simply pursuing a civil property dispute. Forgery, fraudulent notarization, and attempted theft of property through deception are serious criminal offenses. If you're ready, I think it's time we involve law enforcement directly." I thought about Rachel, about the decade of marriage, about the wedding day when I promised to protect and cherish her forever. I thought about Thomas, about our childhood, about everything he had once meant to me as my older brother and protector. And then I thought about the text messages, about the forged signature, about the fraudulent document that had almost succeeded in stealing everything I had built with 12 years of hard work and sacrifice. "I'm ready," I said. "Let's go to the police." Daniel and I walked into the local police station on a cold Thursday morning in November, carrying a thick folder containing every piece of evidence we had gathered over the previous month: the forensic handwriting analysis, Gerald Watkins's signed statement, the bank records showing suspicious transfers, and printed copies of the incriminating text messages between Rachel and Thomas. We met with a detective named Officer Patricia Reyes, who specialized in financial fraud cases within the department. She listened carefully as Daniel explained the situation, occasionally asking sharp, precise questions, taking detailed notes throughout our nearly 2-hour meeting. "Mr. Mitchell," Officer Reyes said once we had finished presenting everything, "I want you to understand that what you've described and what you've documented here appears to constitute several serious criminal offenses: forgery of a legal document, fraudulent notarization, attempted theft by deception. Given the significant value of the property involved, this is not simply a family or civil matter. This is a criminal case, and based on the evidence you've provided, I believe we have sufficient grounds to move forward with a formal investigation." End quote. I felt a strange mixture of emotions hearing this confirmation. Relief, because it validated everything I had discovered, everything I had feared was true, but also a fresh wave of grief, because hearing a police officer confirm that my wife and brother had committed serious crimes against me made the entire situation feel devastatingly, permanently real in a way it had not quite felt before. "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll need to conduct our own independent investigation, verifying the evidence you've provided, and potentially gathering additional evidence of our own," Officer Reyes explained. "Given the strength of what you've already documented, I expect this process to move relatively quickly, likely within the next few weeks. Once our investigation confirms sufficient evidence, we'll move forward with formal arrest warrants." Over the following 2 weeks, the investigation proceeded largely without my direct involvement, though Daniel kept me updated on general progress through his professional contacts. Detectives interviewed Gerald Watkins formally, obtaining an official statement consistent with what he had already told Daniel. They subpoenaed additional bank and phone records, further confirming the timeline and financial arrangements between Rachel and Thomas. They even interviewed the title company representatives who had processed the fraudulent transfer request, establishing a clear, documented chain of how this fraud had been executed. During this period, I made the difficult decision to continue living in our shared home with Rachel, on Daniel's specific advice, to avoid alerting her to the ongoing police investigation before authorities were ready to move forward with formal charges. This was, without question, one of the most emotionally difficult periods of my entire life. I sat across the dinner table from my wife each evening, engaging in ordinary, mundane conversations about daily life, all while knowing that a criminal investigation into her fraudulent actions against me was actively unfolding. Rachel, for her part, seemed to sense something had shifted, though she could not identify exactly what. She became noticeably more anxious during this period, checking her phone more frequently, having hushed conversations in other rooms that she would quickly end whenever I entered. I suspect she and Thomas were growing increasingly nervous about the delayed property transfer, wondering why the process had stalled without clear explanation from the title company. I maintained my composure during this period through sheer determination, reminding myself constantly that justice, real justice, required patience and careful process, rather than emotional confrontation that might allow evidence to be destroyed or hidden before authorities could act. Finally, on a Monday morning in early December, almost 7 weeks after I first discovered that strange email from the title company, Daniel called me with news I had been anxiously awaiting. "David," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of professional seriousness and something like quiet satisfaction, "the police have completed their investigation. Arrest warrants have been issued for both Rachel and Thomas on charges including forgery, fraudulent notarization, and attempted grand theft by deception, given the value of the property involved. They're planning to execute the arrests today." I sat in silence for a long moment after hearing this news, processing the reality that this painful, months-long ordeal was finally reaching its climax. "Do you want to be present when this happens?" Daniel asked gently. "You don't have to be, David. Many people in your situation prefer not to witness the actual arrest. But if you want to be there, I can make arrangements with Officer Reyes." I thought carefully about this question. Part of me wanted to avoid the pain of witnessing this moment directly, but a larger part of me felt that after everything I had endured, after months of careful, painful investigation, I deserved to see this moment of accountability with my own eyes. "I want to be there," I said. "Not to gloat, not for revenge exactly. I just need to see this happen, to finally have some closure after everything they put me through." Daniel arranged for me to be present nearby, though not directly involved in the actual arrest process, when officers executed the warrants later that afternoon. I want to pause the timeline for a moment and describe what those 7 weeks between reporting the fraud to police and the actual arrests truly felt like, because I believe this period tested me in ways I never expected, and I think it matters for anyone who might someday find themselves in a similar situation. Each morning, I woke up beside Rachel, the woman I had shared a bed with for over a decade, knowing something she did not yet know, that a criminal investigation into her actions was actively building against her. Each evening, we sat across from each other at the same dining table where, months earlier, I had once found her and Thomas huddled over papers they quickly hid from view. Papers I now understood were early drafts of the very scheme that would eventually unravel their lives. I forced myself to maintain ordinary conversation during this period. We discussed dinner plans, weekend errands, a cousin's upcoming wedding we had both been invited to attend. I asked about her day at work. She asked about my renovation project at the Commerce Center, the very property she and Thomas were secretly trying to steal from me. I answered her questions calmly, giving no indication of the storm quietly building beneath the surface of our seemingly normal daily life. There were nights during this period when I found myself lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with an almost overwhelming urge to simply confront her directly, to demand answers, to end the unbearable tension of living a double life within my own marriage. Daniel had warned me repeatedly about the importance of patience, explaining that premature confrontation could give Rachel and Thomas time to destroy evidence, transfer remaining assets, or even flee before formal charges could be filed. Still, the emotional toll of maintaining this careful silence grew heavier with each passing week. I remember one particular evening, about 4 weeks into this waiting period, when Rachel reached across the dinner table and took my hand, commenting that I seemed unusually quiet and distant lately, asking if everything was all right. I looked at her in that moment, at the face I had loved for over a decade, and felt an almost unbearable wave of grief, mixed with anger. I told her I was simply tired from the demands of the renovation project, an explanation she seemed to accept without further question. Looking back, I recognize now that this period, despite its painful difficulty, ultimately strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. Each ordinary, deceptively normal interaction with Rachel during those 7 weeks reminded me clearly of exactly how deeply and skillfully she had learned to hide her true intentions from me, reinforcing my determination to see this process through properly, with solid evidence and legitimate legal consequences, rather than allowing emotional exhaustion to push me toward a hasty, less effective confrontation. Thomas, during this same period, continued his occasional visits to our home, maintaining the same friendly, brotherly demeanor he had shown throughout my entire life. I remember one visit in particular, about 3 weeks before the arrests, when he sat in our living room, laughing at some story about a mutual friend, seemingly completely at ease, giving no outward sign whatsoever that he understood the walls were slowly closing in around the scheme he had helped construct. Watching him during that visit, I found myself studying his face carefully, searching for any sign of guilt, any flicker of the resentment Daniel and I now knew he harbored toward me. I found nothing. He remained, outwardly, exactly the same brother I had known and trusted my entire life. A realization that, in some ways, disturbed me more deeply than if he had shown obvious signs of guilt or discomfort during those final weeks before everything changed. I arrived at our neighborhood that afternoon about 30 minutes before the planned arrest, sitting quietly in my car parked down the street from our house, watching as 2 unmarked police vehicles arrived and parked nearby, waiting for the right moment to approach. Officer Reyes had explained the plan to Daniel and me earlier that day. Rachel was at our home, having taken the day off work for what she believed was a routine dentist appointment that afternoon, though officers had confirmed she was still home at the time they planned to execute the arrest. Thomas, meanwhile, was working at a small property management office he had taken a job with several months earlier, a position I now understood he had likely accepted partly to maintain some appearance of financial independence, while secretly awaiting his share of the fraudulent property transfer. Officers coordinated to execute both arrests simultaneously, preventing either Rachel or Thomas from warning the other once law enforcement made contact. I watched from my car as two officers approached our front door. I could not hear the conversation that followed, but I watched Rachel open the door, watched her expression shift rapidly from confusion to shock to something that even from a distance looked unmistakably like dawning horror, as the officers explained why they were there. The officers allowed her a few minutes to gather herself before escorting her toward the waiting police vehicle. As they walked her down our front walkway, the same walkway I had personally installed years earlier during a weekend home improvement project, shortly after we first bought this house together, Rachel's eyes scanned the street and found my car parked nearby. For a moment, our eyes met across that distance. I do not know exactly what she saw in my expression in that moment, whether anger, grief, or simply exhausted resolve. But I saw something in hers that I will never fully forget, a mixture of shame, fear, and what looked like genuine, overwhelming realization of exactly what she had lost. Not just her freedom in that immediate moment, but everything, our marriage, our shared history, the trust and love I had once given her so completely. She began crying as officers guided her into the back seat of the police vehicle, not loud, dramatic sobbing, but quiet, broken tears that seemed to carry the full weight of understanding what she had done and what it had cost her. Across town, according to what Officer Reyes told us afterward, Thomas's arrest unfolded similarly. Officers arrived at his workplace, explaining the charges against him in front of several co-workers, an experience that Officer Reyes noted seemed to genuinely humiliate and devastate him in ways that perhaps the private nature of Rachel's arrest at our home had not quite matched for her. Thomas reportedly did not resist the arrest, but according to witnesses, he too broke down crying once officers explained the specific charges and evidence against him, understanding immediately, given his own knowledge of exactly what he had done, that this represented the complete collapse of the scheme he and Rachel had spent so many months carefully constructing. I did not speak with either Rachel or Thomas directly during their arrests. Daniel had advised strongly against any direct interaction at this stage, both to avoid complicating the ongoing legal process and to protect my own emotional well-being during an already overwhelming moment. Instead, I simply watched from a distance as the police vehicle carrying Rachel pulled away from our house, the house where we had built over a decade of shared memories, both wonderful and, I now understood, ultimately corrupted by a betrayal I never could have imagined when we first moved in together as a young married couple, full of hope and plans for our future. I sat in my car for nearly an hour after the vehicles left, unable to immediately process the full weight of everything that had just happened. Eventually, Daniel called to check on me, his voice gentle and understanding. "How are you holding up, David?" he asked. "I don't know," I answered honestly. Relieved, I think, but also just incredibly sad. These are people I loved, Daniel, my wife, my brother. Watching them get arrested, even knowing they deserved consequences for what they did, it doesn't feel like victory. It just feels like loss. "That's completely understandable," Daniel said. "Justice and grief aren't mutually exclusive, David. You can believe strongly that accountability was necessary while still mourning what you've lost in the process. Both feelings are valid, and you don't need to choose between them." I thought about Daniel's words for a long time that evening, sitting alone in the house that suddenly felt very empty and very quiet, without Rachel's presence for the first time in over a decade. In the weeks following the arrests, the full legal process began moving forward. Both Rachel and Thomas were formally charged with several felony offenses, including forgery, fraudulent notarization conspiracy, and attempted grand theft by deception, given that the property involved was valued at nearly $2 million. Gerald Watkins, the notary who had improperly processed the fraudulent document, also faced serious consequences. He ultimately lost his notary license permanently and faced separate civil liability for his role in enabling the fraud through improper procedure, even though investigators concluded he had not knowingly participated in the scheme itself, merely failed to follow proper verification procedures that could have prevented it entirely. Rachel and Thomas both hired separate defense attorneys, and initially, both pleaded not guilty, apparently hoping to fight the charges despite the substantial evidence against them. However, as their respective legal teams reviewed the forensic handwriting analysis, the notary's cooperative testimony, the financial records, and especially the incriminating text messages that clearly documented their planning and intentions, both eventually recognized that fighting these charges at trial carried significant risk of even harsher sentencing if convicted by a jury. About 4 months after their arrests, both Rachel and Thomas accepted plea agreements, admitting guilt to reduce charges in exchange for more lenient sentencing than they might have faced if convicted at trial on the original, more serious charges. Rachel received a sentence involving 18 months of actual incarceration, followed by an extended period of probation, along with mandatory restitution requirements. Thomas, given his more direct role in physically presenting the forged document to the notary, received a slightly longer sentence of 2 years incarceration, followed by similar probation and restitution requirements. I attended both sentencing hearings, sitting quietly in the courtroom gallery, watching as 2 people I had once loved and trusted completely faced formal legal consequences for what they had done to me. During Rachel's sentencing hearing, she was given an opportunity to address the court, and she used this moment to offer a tearful apology, directed partly toward the judge, but also, she said, specifically toward me. "David," she said, turning to look at me directly across the courtroom, her voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "I know an apology can't undo what I did. I let greed and, honestly, deep insecurity about never quite matching your success convince me that I deserved something I never had any right to take. I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused you, and I understand if you can never forgive me." I did not respond directly in that moment, unsure exactly how to process such a direct, emotional apology from someone who had caused me such profound betrayal. I simply nodded slightly, acknowledging that I had heard her words, without offering any promise of forgiveness I did not yet feel ready to give. Thomas's sentencing hearing, held about 2 weeks later, unfolded somewhat different. Where Rachel had appeared genuinely remorseful, Thomas seemed to struggle more visibly with fully accepting responsibility, his statement to the court focusing significantly on his own financial struggles and feelings of inadequacy compared to my success, explanations that, while perhaps offering some psychological context for his actions, still felt to me like an attempt to shift some blame away from his own choices and onto circumstances beyond his control. "David," he finally said, turning toward me near the end of his statement, his voice thick with emotion. "You were always the better brother, the more successful one. I told myself for years that it wasn't fair, that our father and mother, that everyone, always saw more potential in you than in me. I let that resentment build up until I convinced myself that taking what you had earned would somehow balance things between us. I know now how wrong that was. I'm sorry, David. I really am." Hearing my brother finally articulate the resentment that had apparently been building for years, resentment I had never once suspected during our seemingly warm, supportive relationship throughout adulthood, brought a strange, complicated mixture of understanding and continued heartbreak. Understanding because it helped explain, at least partially, how someone who had once protected me so fiercely as children could eventually betray me so completely as an adult. Heartbreak, because it revealed that this resentment had apparently existed for years beneath the surface of our relationship, hidden behind countless family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and moments I had genuinely believed reflected authentic brotherly love and support. Before I move forward to how I rebuilt my life after these events, I want to share more about what came out during the legal proceedings, because I believe it reveals just how deliberate and calculated this entire scheme truly was. something that became painfully clear once prosecutors laid out the full timeline in court. During the plea hearing, the prosecutor, a sharp, thorough woman named Miriam Cole, walked through the evidence in careful detail. She explained how Thomas had first suggested the idea to Rachel nearly a year before the forged document was ever created, during a period when Thomas was facing significant financial pressure after losing a stable job. Text messages recovered from his phone showed him initially framing the idea almost as a joke, testing Rachel's reaction. "Wouldn't it be easy," one early message read, "if David just wasn't so careful about all his paperwork?" Rachel's response, recovered in the same thread, was not immediate rejection, but curiosity. Over the following weeks, according to the messages presented in court, their conversation shifted from joking speculation into genuine planning, discussing which properties would be easiest to transfer, which documents I kept where, and how long a transfer might take to process without drawing my attention. Miriam Cole also presented financial records showing that Rachel had, several months before the forgery occurred, quietly opened a separate bank account under her maiden name, an account I never knew existed until this investigation. Wire transfer records showed several small payments